are the two largest economies in the world and two most impactful countries in the world. Now, whether the relations between these two countries, including in the technology side, and also more prominently now, including in the fight against the coronavirus, the relations go in a normal way, or we are running the risk of major disruptions in the bilateral relations between China and the United States, including in the technology side. This is of major importance to China and the United States, but also to the whole world. Tonight's webinar will have a total of 2 hours. We have two portions. The first portion, where we will ask each of the 7 distinguished panelists to share with us their views on this very important topic. And the second portion, for about 30 minutes, we will answer questions from the global audience, including questions that each of these signed up people can send us through the internet. And please allow me to start by expressing condolences to all the people who perished because of the coronavirus attack, either in China or in the United States or anywhere else in the world. We feel very sorry and traumatized by their death, and we do mourn their death, and we do hope their relatives will overcome their griefs and sorrows. And we do hope mankind can get united to fight against the coronavirus. We also thank our global audience in China, in the United States, and most likely throughout the world for tuning in and listening in and watching us when we do the debate. Allow me to mention very quickly, as the coronavirus is really wreaking havoc throughout the world, triggering lots of lockdowns, shelter in place, and social distancing, for example, of all forms in different countries because of the circumstances in these different countries. We also see rapid progress in technologies, especially in telecommunication and internet technologies, because these technologies have played a major and increasingly important role in mankind's fight against coronavirus. And it is manifested in many, many ways, and we can listen to our panelists as to how they see these rapidly evolving and developing technologies in the fight against the coronavirus. What does this tremendous phenomenon mean for mankind? And what are we looking for the world of tomorrow? That is the world when mankind has finally conquered this coronavirus 19 attack on mankind. I believe this world of tomorrow will be very much characterized by major technological innovations and breakthroughs. And this is the topic. What are the proposals? What are the recommendations coming out of China and from the United States? And what will be the impact if these major breakthroughs and megatrends are handled very properly, or if, for example, major disruptions will be taking place, and who will be detrimented by these major disruptions, for example, and what can we do to prevent such disruptions? Of relevant topics for our discussion, and each of the 7 distinguished panelists will talk about this, we will focus on during the period when China enacted strict physical isolation rules. How did the Chinese mobile applications and digital technologies in education, e-commerce, and mass entertainment cope with the sudden shock and reinvigorate growth? I would say China has deployed lots of these new applications in the fight against the coronavirus, and the Chinese people have benefited a great deal. And also another topic is in the aftermath of the coronavirus outbreak, Chinese government issued stimulus plans centered on new infrastructure. What is this new infrastructure drive different from the one emerged out of the 2008 financial crisis? What does China's push to invest in its digital future mean for global business? Another topic we want to discuss is what can the pandemic teach the tech communities in China and the United States? What proposals from the business sectors will better prepare nations and economies for future health threats? What did technological innovation, how did technological innovation become the engine of the American growth in the post-war era? And what can that historical episode shed light on today's major economies facing recession caused by the pandemic? And will the COVID-19 pandemic spark a worldwide tendency toward economic self-sufficiency or dislocation or disengagement from each other? What will that mean for the future of technologies and future of innovation? Gathered around us virtually, we have 9 distinguished experts and authorities, very well known in their own field and also globally. Allow me to mention their name very quickly. We have Mr. Robert Atkinson, President of Information and Technology and Innovation Foundation. He is joining from San Francisco. It's very early, 5:30 in the morning. We have Professor Fu Xiaolan, Professor and Founding Director of the Technology and Management Center for Development, Oxford University. We have John Holden, Senior Associate with the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics, CSIS, and also a Senior Director of Macaulay Associates. We have Michael Kuan, my old friend, who is a founder and CEO of Kuan Capital, CCG Vice Chair. And we also have Sean Randolph, Senior Director of Bay Area Council Economic Institute. We have Mr. Chen Kuan, Vice President and Chief Economist of JD.com. And finally, but not the least, we have Mr. Wu Xingbo, Professor and Director of the Center for American Studies, Dean, Institute for International Studies, Fudan University, one of the best universities in China and in Asia and in the world. Now, without further ado, shall I just start this round of panel discussions by the 7 distinguished experts, and each expert will talk up to about 10 minutes, and it will add up to about 70 minutes total for the first segment. So with that agreement, let me give the floor in alphabetical order to Dr. Robert Atkinson, President, Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Thank you, Professor Atkinson. You have the floor now. Professor Atkinson, are you online? I think we probably experienced some technological problems. So while we, Professor Atkinson, are you online?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. We just started and we want to give the floor to you as the first panel expert to talk about this very important topic of technology and coronavirus lessons and proposals from China and the United States. Thank you, Professor Atkinson. You have the floor, up to 10 minutes.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Speaking of the importance of technology, for some strange reason, my computer is not providing sound to me. So I apologize for not being able to log in with video. So I run a think tank in Washington, D.C., Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. And I think to us, what's striking about the pandemic and what the implications are for technology and information technology is really twofold. We wrote a report about 2 weeks ago identifying about 28 different issues that Congress of the U.S. could be addressing when it came to any kind of stimulus package or economic package for recovery that relate to technology. And they really fall into two categories, if you will. One are areas where we really should have been making a lot more progress over the last 5 years or so, but simply didn't. And we didn't make progress in these areas largely for policy failures. And I'll talk about some of those. And the second are areas where we didn't make progress because the technology is so new, but so promising. And this also is suggest areas where, again, I'll have my comments related to the U.S. context, which I know the best. So on the first type of questions or issues, let me start with a simple and important one, and that's telehealth. In this time of crisis, more and more people are going to need to be able to engage with healthcare providers using the internet. And yet the U.S. is woefully behind on that. And one of the main reasons we're behind is that we've never bothered to upgrade and modernize our systems, both in terms of payments so that doctors can and hospitals and others can receive payments for telehealth. And also because in the United States, we have 50 different states and each state has their own rules around telehealth. And Congress has not passed a national telehealth bill to streamline and allow cross-state border telehealth. So there's a good example of if we had done all of those things in the past, as we should have, but we didn't, we would be in a much better position today for telehealth. Another good example is just the ability of government to operate in what you could call an isolation economy. I'm struck by the fact that my bank, my insurance company, my credit card company, many of these, all of these companies, frankly, they have enabled all of their workers in call centers and others to work at home. So if you have a problem, you just call the 1-800 number and you get in touch with a worker who happens to be working at home on a computer or hooked up to the corporate system. Now, when it comes to the federal government, that's not the case. In the federal government and in some state governments, they have not provisioned their IT systems so that workers can work at home. And you basically cannot engage with the government for weeks, maybe months on end. Another major problem in the U.S. is we have a state unemployment insurance system. So when workers are unemployed, they can collect payments. And obviously in the U.S., as in most countries, this is a crisis now, and we have tens of millions of workers, or 15 million workers now unemployed. The problem is that the states' governments who run these websites, many of them have not, believe it or not, have not put them in the cloud. They run them off their own servers. And as you would expect, these servers simply cannot handle the demand, and they crash, and you can't get online. Many of these government sites have not been optimized for mobile. About 20% of Americans, the only way they get online is through their smartphone or similar device, and yet they can't engage with government there. So again, this is an area where the U.S. simply has failed. We failed because we didn't want to make the needed investments. And I think what that will mean, hopefully, will be that it's policymakers at the federal and the state government level will look at this as a wake-up call and say, okay, it's time for us to become fully digital. We've got to move to the cloud. We've got to make sure that all systems can be done, or virtually all, online and remotely, because while we can hope and pray that the COVID virus pandemic will abate at some point, we can't be sure that we won't face a similar crisis in the future. And so we need to be ready. In the area, so there are many other areas like that. And another one I would mention would be data sharing. While we've had good data sharing in the U.S. for the disease, it's not good enough. And one of the problems is we have two problems. One is that we don't have interoperable data systems in healthcare, for example. We don't even have machine readable data oftentimes in cases. So what we need in the United States and in China and frankly in all countries is we need the healthcare system to be completely digital, completely interoperable, and ability to take that data and mine it and analyze it, including using AI, to really discover insights in real time about this crisis. And you can do that in a way that is completely privacy protective, but you need a system and an infrastructure in place, which we simply, we don't certainly have it fully as we should. Let me just mention a couple of, in my last few minutes, a couple of things I think that are exciting about going forward. One is the whole area of autonomous systems. Many Americans are now at home. In most states, they have stay-at-home orders and require people to deliver medical drugs, prescription drugs, and groceries and other like that if they don't want to go out. But we should have a ubiquitous drone system. Drones are getting close, and if we had a ubiquitous drone system in the U.S., particularly in areas where it's easy to do that, you could imagine that it would be so much easier now for Americans to get things delivered to their house. It would require fewer workers, require fewer people to be in contact with one another. Same thing with autonomous vehicles. There's a whole issue now in the U.S. where our buses, the workers, the drivers are rightly concerned about getting coronavirus. But imagine if we had autonomous buses, or at least for parts of our cities. Imagine autonomous vehicles so that when you get in a car, you don't have to worry about is the driver potentially carrying the disease, carrying the virus. So autonomous systems are an area where I think there's a lot of promise, and robotics overall. We see a lot of factories now in the United States that are working hard to be able to reopen, but they're not quite sure how to do that and how to be able to do it in a way that keeps their workers safe. But again, if we had much more better and more ubiquitously deployed robotics technology, we'd be able to operate the economy in a much more sustainable way with fewer risks. And the last point I just mentioned, I think one of the most interesting, at least from a sort of economic or policy or technology perspective of this entire crisis is what's going to be the effect on industries as we go forward. You could imagine higher education, for example, being fairly seriously transformed. We now realize that it's possible to learn through distance learning, and yet we've had institutional resistance in the United States from universities and colleges. They don't want to do that, but now they may be forced to do that, and we could see a real upheaval in American universities now, where students don't only have to go to class face-to-face. They could be taking massive open online courses from the best professors in the world. Same thing with retail. I think this has been a real eye-opener to a lot of people that more and more people are shopping online through Amazon or Walmart or other online retailers, and I think that is going to be it'll dip back, obviously, but I think that's going to be a permanent effect, and we're going to see a restructuring of retail in the U.S. towards a real acceleration of online and all the implications of that for smaller retailers and even bigger retailers that are bricks and mortar going out of business. So transportation obviously is another whole area. So I think what I think the crisis will hopefully do when it comes to technology is spur us all to move forward faster with complete digitalization of the economy and getting the policies right to make that possible. So with that, I appreciate appreciate you inviting me to be on this, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Atkinson. We thank you also because you got up very early in San Francisco. It's very early in the morning, and
I'm actually in DC, Washington, DC, so it's not too bad for me. It's almost 9 in the morning. So thank you, though.
That's better. And I hope our thanks remain the same. Thank you very much for calling in and joining. And I hope we can see your face very quickly online. And I think Dr. Atkinson mentioned very important points. And I hope research institutions and scholars can do a research globally to see, in terms of fighting against the coronavirus, which society or countries having higher level of internet connection, for example, and telecommunication systems, infrastructure, applications have dealt with this fight against coronavirus better. For example, if we look at South Korea, it's doing very well. China's Hong Kong doing very, very well. And mainland China is doing very well, thanks very largely to many successful applications on the internet. And we can talk more about it. But I think those societies and those countries which have not moved up to speed in terms of internet connectivity, 5G as we call it, probably will suffer more because of the lack of efficiency and ease of operation in mobilizing people and alerting people and do all kinds of contact tracing, for example, to prevent more widespread contamination and infection of the people. We can talk more about this topic in the coming minutes. And now I have the great honor to give the floor to Professor Fu Xiaolan, who is a professor and founding director of the Technology and Management Center for Development, University of Oxford. And I understand Professor Fu is joining us from London. Professor Fu, the floor is yours for 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor, and many thanks to CCG for inviting me. It is a great privilege to be part of this distinguished panel. There are many innovations emerge to combat the coronavirus. And I believe my other distinguished colleagues will give more vivid examples of the applications later. And I will focus on the post-coronavirus landscape of innovation from a global perspective. So it's a more macro discussion, but will set the background and the stage for our discussion. So given the uncertainties in many aspects, it is difficult to predict an accurate picture of the global innovation landscape after the pandemic. On the one hand, the pandemic is a wake-up call for global innovation collaboration. We have seen collaborations taking place between scientists from different countries in developing test kits, developing vaccinations, and drugs. The format of collaboration includes sharing data, sharing DNA sequences, joint research, joint publications, and also using telephone conferences like what we are doing now today to share tacit knowledge. For example, the rapid development of some of the drugs benefited from the DNA sequence published and shared in an open database. And there are also knowledge sharing in non-medical measures, such as infected person tracking, online medical service provision like the telehealth, and also e-business to support people who are in quarantine, kind of have to stay at home. And also the use of drones and also use of autonomous cars and autonomous taxis. I have seen one yesterday, like in China. So there are also a lot of sharing in the non-med measures. That's on the one hand, we see collaboration. However, on the other hand, the worsening relationship between the US and China, the two biggest economies in the world, may lead to geopolitical crisis, which will freeze the already quite cold atmosphere between US and China and further damage the global innovation system. I don't think that the global innovation system will be split into two camps, like what we had in the Cold War. Europe and other countries already made it clear they don't want to take sides. So they will be more pragmatic and try to benefit from the both sides. But they have to try very hard to stand in the middle. And but more challenging and difficult are the scientists and the researchers in all countries, not only in China and the US. They will be put under pressure and feel the chill wind around them. So if that happens, this could be a disaster to the global innovation community. Therefore, the post-coronavirus global innovation landscape can go either way, and the governments and also the political leaders really need to deal with it carefully. However, this is a battle between human society and the virus to save life. This is also a battle to save jobs and the income, because the pandemic has profound impact on the global economy. There are common interests between China and the US. Therefore, I propose 4 areas that China and the US can work together, and also together with Europe and other countries in the world. First, China and the US can collaborate on research and innovation that directly address the pandemic and other global challenges. Why innovation collaboration is so important? In addition to greater resources, greater diversity will benefit innovation. Scientific and technological progress nowadays are much more complex than before. So innovation is increasingly a collaborative undertaking. A recent annual report published by Nature indicates that nearly half of the world-class publication produced in US and in Europe come from international collaboration. Now we are facing an unprecedented challenge to humanity. So only through collaboration can we produce the new medicine quicker and to the highest quality. So for the US and China, I appreciate there are differences between the countries. We can start from collaboration to combat the virus. This will also be a very valuable trust building process between the countries, and build up the trust, and this will solve one of the fundamental problems between the two countries. I remember a Stanford medical scientist, a medical professor, came to China in early February to help Chinese scientists to get more understanding of the new virus. And the collaboration will be an icebreaker for the freezing water. We don't have other better choices. Today's China has developed the capacity to make valuable contributions in many areas of innovation, especially digital technology. There are a lot of innovations coming up in recent years during the pandemic, and also China has 2 of the world's top 10 giants in digital industry, and also there are many new powerful innovative companies like JD and others, in addition to Tencent and Alibaba. So I hope US government sees this and takes on this opportunity. I call for actions from politicians to create a favorable and encouraging environment for the innovation collaboration between the countries. This needs a mindset change and seeing each other not as competitors, but as neighbors that can generate positive spillovers. Secondly, the US and China can collaborate on their support to the developing countries, especially the low-income countries, in building their technological and production capacity to combat COVID-19 and other global challenges. Some collaboration or coordination can be made on the multilateral or 3-party arrangement. For example, joint research in localization of technology related to public health, in scaling up digital technology to support local production and services provision. Even any third party or three country consortium or more country joint consortium to help the low income countries. Thirdly, China and the US can coordinate on the science, technology, and innovation policy. I noticed that Professor Atkinson has a new article entitled "The Case for a National Industrial Strategy to Counter China's Technological Rise." Actually, I welcome this idea of an industrial strategy for the US. As the same as I support Chinese government's new document on strengthening the role of market in resource allocation. Why? We want the US people have better life and jobs as the same as that we want for the Chinese. So national innovation system includes not only firms and markets, but also public institutions and the government. They are actors in the innovation system. Moreover, innovation is costly and risky. So markets acting alone are not enough to effectively address the challenge, as Robert said. So there is a role for the state to promote innovation and overcome market failure. Such kind of policy convergence in thinking, in policy will enable countries to make better policies and also understand each other better. Domestic policies should be strengthened to address distortions in the domestic economy, not trade or foreign policy. Finally, my final point, US and China shall work together to stabilize the global supply chain. The pandemic has brought significant disruption to the global supply chain. Cancellation of orders means loss of jobs and income for many workers in many factories along the chain, not only in one or two countries. Yes, such disruption and uncertainty may spark a worldwide tendency towards economic self-sufficiency. Decoupling is often heard recently. Some even talk about state economy. However, such a reverse of history sounds politically correct, but it means a huge loss of efficiency globally and a big opportunity cost for a country which can specialize in high value added activity, but then turn back to produce t-shirts or shoes. It also means a huge welfare loss for all the consumers, that they have to pay at higher price for products or services at lower quality. Therefore, I call for the US and China as global leaders to defend openness in innovation, in trade, and in economy in face of this disaster of COVID-19. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Fu. I think you made excellent points. I do agree with you that the world is either at or getting very close to a turning point. Whether China and the United States will be decoupled, as some call for, or whether these two countries will continue to deal with each other in decency and with fairness to each other, with equality with each other, so that more people, more countries will benefit. And I think we also need to ask, who will benefit if China and the United States are really decoupled? Who will be detrimented? And I personally believe neither China nor the United States will be net winners. Both countries will suffer because of the technological decoupling, because of the disengagement of China and the United States. And I think your 4 points recommendation really need to be very much heeded for by China, by the United States, by the governments, as well as by academics and corporates, for example. And I do hope we will have more and more such discussions and exchange of ideas. And I hope we can make our own personal contribution to making sure that both China and the United States win rather than lose from the future development of the relations in the coming months and in the coming years. May I now give the floor to Mr. John Holden, Senior Associate with the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at CSIS, and also Senior Director and Head of China Practice at McCarthy Associates. I know Mr. Holden for many years. He's really a China hand, China expert, and I see there is a Chinese calligraphy, very beautiful calligraphy on the window frame. And I hope this really indicates that Mr. Holden probably understands the Chinese culture better than I do. Mr. Holden, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor. And the calligraphy I actually find very inspiring. It says in Chinese, "Feng Yuan Lun Dao," which is kind of what we're doing, talking about principles while we're living in the cloud, if you will. Anyway, thank you to CCG for organizing today's meeting. It's great that we have a chance to get together. In fact, in some ways, it's easier than it used to be when we had to meet in person. I've been engaged in U.S.-China relations as a businessman, NGO leader, and educator for really more than 40 years. And I have to say, U.S.-China relations have never been so bad, frankly, and bad in so many dimensions. It was inspiring to hear Professor Fu come up with 4 very positive and thoughtful suggestions for how we get things back on track. And I hope that her ideas will be given full consideration by people who can make a difference. Well, fortunately, U.S.-China relations is not my main topic today. Instead, I'll be talking about an area where there has been considerable cross-pollination and cooperation between the U.S. and China over the years, and that is in technology and businesses built on innovation. I'd like to set the stage with 3 principles about technology that I think will be relevant to our discussion. The first principle to keep in mind is that technology is based on knowledge and ideas which themselves have a strong tendency to be shared, despite efforts to keep them secret in some cases. So there's a sharing of technology, flows across borders. A second principle I want to call our attention to is that knowledge and ideas are really difficult to assign values to. What are the technologies that of the future that deserve investment? This is hard. It's hard to know, and this is why the venture capital industry is so competitive, difficult, and for some, I think, exciting. The third principle is that businesses are built and managed on practical approaches to problems. Victor, I know, used to spent a lot of time with Deng Xiaoping, and whose famous line was "实事求是," which means seeking what works from facts. But that's my translation. I hope Victor doesn't disagree with it. Sometimes translated as seeking truth from facts, but it's really about seeking what's practical and what works. So that's how businesses approach problems. The implications of these principles are many, of course, but let's try to apply them to the topic that I've agreed to talk about, which is how are American and Chinese companies adapting to disrupted global tech value chains? Well, to arrive at practical solutions to their challenges, business leaders, first of all, have to understand what's going on in the world that affects them. My company, McClarty, we play a role in providing guidance that can help CEOs and business leaders shape their decisions. An example is that we are now doing, after the coronavirus, we're doing a daily report we call the COVID Navigator that gives business leaders a snapshot about COVID-19 around the world and gives them related business information that they can use. So the first part is understanding what's going on. Secondly, then, what leaders do is they make their best judgment about action while reserving a plan B or a plan C in case that decision proves to be wrong. In the case of technology value chains, there are today two major challenges. One is from disruptions to production caused by the coronavirus. People are unable to go to work. We know about this. Apple, for example, just yesterday had announced an adjustment in the launch date of their new iPhone. Companies around the world are deeply involved in trying to understand how the pandemic will affect production in each country where they source parts. So that's the coronavirus is one of the challenges. The second challenge comes from government policy. We were talking about Huawei a little bit earlier. Huawei's had to redesign its technology strategies because of US export restrictions. Many more Chinese companies will now have to make adjustments because of the US Commerce Department's new rules on export licenses. Well, not all policy challenges originate in Washington, D.C., of course. Beijing also champions indigenous innovation to the disadvantage of foreign companies. The foreign companies have to understand what's going on in China. As Professor Fu pointed out, technology and innovation hold out great promise for humanity. And ideally, unfettered collaboration across borders should be our ideal. Just imagine if the world's top biotech researchers joined forces to come up with cures and vaccines for COVID-19 or to treat cancer. Wait, you say, isn't that already happening? Well, yes, to an extent. But we still have challenges. We haven't yet figured out how best to protect each other's interests. I think that we need to be more creative to find ways to effectively ensure the protection of intellectual property across borders. If we do that, I'm certain that collaborative innovation would grow significantly. Let me conclude by offering a few educated guesses about what we will see over the next few years in the wake of the coronavirus. First, I don't think American multinationals will abandon the China market, mainly because it's going to still remain profitable for them. However, at the same time, they will look to continue to strengthen the resiliency of their global supply chains. Second, firms with sensitive dual-use technology will be, in many cases, forced to stay in their home markets. So dual-use technology, there will be less cooperation. Third, the high-tech battleground, if you will, between the US and China will continue to be confusing and difficult to manage. Companies will have opportunities to be successful only if they know where the landmines are likely to be. Fourth, other countries, including some in Latin America, will seek deeper economic integration with the US, trying to take advantage of the souring relationship between the US and China. Fifth, companies and their employers will discover that teleworking is not only possible, but it's cost efficient. And lastly, getting back to full employment is going to be very, very difficult. There are massive social political challenges ahead for countries around the world as a result of the coronavirus. I'd like to close with a comment about decoupling. I don't like the term, frankly, because I don't think it makes any sense. It's not as if the two economies have been coupled in a deep way. The US and China have had a sort of what you could call a managed economic engagement from the very beginning. China has been protecting and championing some of its industries, while the US, for its part, has limited the sales of its top technologies to China. So they've really not been coupled. And we would say that parts of the economies are off limits to the other. For example, China doesn't make it possible for Western internet companies to prosper or survive in China. So if we're not looking at decoupling, what are we like to see? Well, what I can see, at least for the foreseeable future, is a more closely managed economic relationship. We could call it perhaps a closely supervised economic engagement. So we will continue to work with one another economically, but it will evolve, and it's going to be, the cooperation will in some cases be significantly narrower. That's all I have. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Holden. I think your points are really very meaningful, very significant. And I think your recommendations are also very much timely for the decision makers, for the corporates, for the think tanks and academics to really think about. I think the Chinese calligraphy on top of your window frame can be translated into discourse in wind and cloud. That's a very, very timely and relevant calligraphy for all of us. We are really discussing many things in cloud and also in wind. We are in a very choppy atmosphere right now involving China-US relations, coronavirus, and the impact on the technologies, etc. Now, for your quote of the late paramount leader Deng Xiaoping, I think the official translation is to seek truth from facts. And also Deng Xiaoping mentioned, and this has been a guidance for me, probably for the rest of my life too, is to the practice is the only litmus test of truth. So whatever you believe in, if you believe in something, you need to really put it into test. So for China-US relations, we also need to put it into test. We also need to prove to the satisfaction of the Chinese people and the American people that more cooperation actually benefits both the American people as well as the Chinese people. And for someone like me who spent 4 years in New Haven, studying at Yale University as well as the Yale Law School, it really pains me to hear some of the politicians in Washington saying they want to ban Chinese students from American universities. That will be a huge loss for China, but also it will be a huge loss to the United States. I think, as a rule of thumb, about 3/4 of the Chinese students studying in the United States eventually decide to remain in the United States. Most of them, if not all of them, eventually become naturalized as law-abiding US citizens. And I think they make great contribution to the development of the United States. Only about 1/4 of them come back to the United States. And China graduates about 8 million college graduates every year. It's a very large talent pool. About 1 million of them earns engineering degrees. And also, China is also the largest supply of students to Japan, to many European countries, to Australia, Canada, New Zealand, you name it. So I think more exchanges actually will encourage more innovation and technological breakthrough. We cannot erect walls and try to hide behind these walls as if that will create a haven for any one particular country. I'm a big advocate of more and more academic and scholarly exchanges. And I hope our webinar today is just one of the many things which are happening on a positive note in the world. Thank you, Mr. Holden. Now, shall I have the great honor of giving the floor to Mr. Michael Kuan, founder and chairman of the Kuan Capital. He's also a vice chair of CCG. And Mr. Kuan is a very highly regarded VC expert in China and Silicon Valley. I've known Michael Kuan for decades. And he is right now joining us from Shanghai. So, Mr. Kuan, please give us your thoughts on this very important and big topic of technologies, lessons, and experiences from China and the United States in the fight against coronavirus, but also more generally for innovation, technological breakthroughs, cooperation, and the prospect of China-US relations going forward. Thank you, Mr. Kuan.
Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me, and also thank you for all the listeners and previous speakers. I think they're quite excellent. After listening to them, I think we we can just move forward and taking your suggestions. But having suffered a little bit from the SARS and also I traveled a bit during the early part of this crisis or pandemic. And we also been very lucky and to be staying in Shanghai, which we think is one of, come to realize is I was born here, but is quite, in some ways, very civilized and orderly. And I think finally we're returning to restaurants, to golf courses, and schools are opening. I think that's a very good sign. However, I think while we are optimistic of maybe winning the first phase of this pandemic, we need to really, really slow down. I think is the path that we have been through was the correct one. We have 7 billion people in the world, but little so-called unknown enemy of the world and shut down the whole world. While we're talking, there are lots of people are still not knowing whether they have a job or not, whether it's in the United States or in China or India. I just learned this morning, and the U.S. Stanford University or medical school is laying off 1,000 staffs during this pandemic. So I think we're not out of this difficulty yet. And what happens if the virus comes back in the fall? What happens if a new virus comes back every other year? What is about economy? What is about the U.S.-China relationship? What is about technology? It's not a matter anymore. What about our kids, the young people who are going to schools, who are just born, who not had a very good 40 years of peaceful lifetime? So we must think about that. I think in terms of technology, I came to the conclusion is we were very, very good in lockdown everybody else. I think with some exception in the United States, even the country in India, lockdown was very successful, but not very successful in fighting the virus. We're not very successful in coming up with the drugs. We're not successful in having vaccines. Neither we did vaccine for HIV or SARS. Why? It's not about technology. We could do that because it didn't make money. Vaccine does not make money for big drug companies. In China, we have this lockdown. A lot of people have ordinary disease, not able to go to all the hospital check because we have these restrictions. But you look at the United States, 18% of US GDP is in healthcare. But what we'll witness is a really chaos. Why? Because most of the money goes to treating very expensive disease. And 18% of US GDP is what? It's like 27% of China's GDP. So 27%, almost 30% of Chinese GDP is spent in healthcare. And according to one statistics I read, is only for taking care of older people for the last few years. Something wrong. And we have the best technologies. Speaking of technology, I had the honor to be a shareholder, a small investor. 2 years ago, I visited a company called Moderna, which is the first company using RNA messenger that just got into the first human trials, fast proved by FDA to do trials in Washington. And I also know there's Chinese teams are doing vaccines. But when we're going to have that? Are we very close? Is it 18 months? Or when we have another one coming to China, or coming to the United States, we will be able to fight for it. So we think my conclusion is technology we have is very good, but not good enough, especially in public health. And most of the time, public health do not make money. And that's something we really should address it, because only if you address that,
I think there are some technical difficulties involving connection to Michael Kuan. So, so we will try to get Michael Kuan back online, and we can continue to listen to his very good ideas. So without further ado, may I move on to the next one? Dr. Sean Randolph, who is a senior director of the Bay Area Council Economic Institute, a California-based research group, is joining us from San Francisco, which is very early in the morning, I think, if I do not get wrong, or whether Sean has moved to somewhere else. I think as Michael Kuan was talking about, there are actually lots of connections between the PE institutions, the VC institutions involving China and the United States. And over the past several decades, I think both China and the United States benefited a lot in the financial cooperation between the two countries. And I hope this trend will benefit both the Americans and the Chinese, and will continue to benefit the great people of these two countries. And I'm really very much worried about some of the politicians in Washington who are urging, for example, putting a stop to such financial cooperation between these two countries. And I would say people like Michael Kuan, those experts in PC, VC and PE, for example, have promoted lots of these technological cooperations between China and the United States. And both these countries benefited a lot in the financial sector and in the technological and venture and PE sectors. And I hope this megatrend will continue, because China-US cooperations are truly very, very important, not only for these two countries, but for the world as a whole. So now allow me to give the floor to Dr. Sean Randolph, please. Sean, you have the floor for 10 minutes. Thank you, Sean. Please turn on your mic. Please turn on your mic. Sean, I think we can hear you, but without your, yes. I think you are on now, Sean. You have the floor. Thank you, Sean.
Okay. Thank you very much, Victor. Sorry, I've been having a little technical challenge this morning. I'm really glad to be with you. I came out of Zoom the moment we began. And so thanks very much again for the invitation to join you today. And yes, I am in San Francisco. The sun is just coming up here. I'm glad Rob got a few extra hours sleep this morning. So I might say something about how we're experiencing this and what we see happening in terms of technology here in Silicon Valley. We've been on a lockdown here in Northern California for about 6 weeks now. We were the earliest in the US to go in about mid-March. That was just extended through the month of May. So we will have been at home for about 2.5 months. The good news is we started quite early and are in much better shape than New York or some other parts of the US. But an extended lock-in, and it's really brought home, I think, the centrality of technology to the environment we're in today and the environment we're going to be in the future, and the central role of major technology centers globally, such as Silicon Valley, but in China and Europe and elsewhere, as well. Just thinking about it, and I'm speaking from somebody sitting in the US, China's of course a bit different. All of us are communicating on platforms like Zoom and Slack, Microsoft Teams, LinkedIn, Google Hangouts. People are on Facebook here more than ever. Companies like Postmates, Instacart, DoorDash, Uber Eats are delivering things to our homes more and more. People are zoning out, watching Netflix and YouTube. And one of the things that struck me the other day is all of these companies, with maybe only the exception of Microsoft, are all headquartered within 50 miles of San Francisco International Airport. So this concentration of activity, it's really being brought to bear now on the virus situation. Of course, connectivity is one part of the story, but looking to the medical side of the issues, I've never seen anything comparable. And of course, we are in a completely new world right now about how different parts of the technology, both biotech and tech, have come together as one really to address what's going on. Of course, you have the large universities like Stanford, Berkeley, University of California, San Francisco, UC Davis, others really being all hands on deck to address this. But then you have lots and lots of smaller startups, younger companies really stepping up in very creative and innovative ways. I can't count them all, but you find companies like Vir Biotechnology working with colleagues in Boston, at Biogen in Cambridge, and also with Fu Xiaolan Biologics in China. We're finding large companies, biotechs like Genentech, and science also really deep into clinical trials, sometimes in partnership with colleagues in China. You find the Alphabet's DeepMind AI unit actively in the search for vaccines. Its Verity Life Science unit, research arm looking at virus detection. We're seeing really unprecedented Google and Apple working together on smartphone technology that would enable better global tracking, engaging about 3 billion people. And even companies that wouldn't be likely when you think of it at first, like 23andMe, that does the genealogy tracking. They have a massive genealogy database, and they're using that to search for COVID-19 patterns that can also enable better tracking. Also, Intel is working with Lenovo and also with BGI in Shenzhen to try to speed genomic sequencing through supercomputing. And it goes on and on. And so I think we're seeing a massive level of focus and investment, really unprecedented, between tech companies that are doing what they're doing, communication platforms, internet-enabled services, remote services, but also the life science companies coming together actually with tech companies like Intel and others. And there's a few takeaways that come to mind on this. One is that science matters. Here in the US, sometimes there's been a bit of a debate, especially with our current administration, about the importance of investment in science. I think it is more important than ever, and we should all realize that here in the US. China's done a really good job investing in science over the years. Another is that innovation is collaborative and it's often global. We're seeing companies here working extremely closely with partners in Boston in particular, around the US, but also extensively with partners in China. So university scientists working with scientists in Chinese universities, as well as technology companies working with industry partners in China. So it's a global challenge. It really is a case for global collaboration. And the other takeaway is that governance does really matter when it comes to these global challenges, that we really are all in this together, and that our responses, while they're inevitably rooted in national systems, really call for an integrated response if they're going to be effective, which is a real opportunity for the US and China. I think looking at the opportunities for scientific collaboration around the virus situation, I think transparency is really, really important to trust in the ability to work together. I have to say, I was a little bit taken aback reading a few weeks ago when it was reported that Chinese scientists who are doing research on the origins of the virus need to clear their research before it's released with the government. So that doesn't seem to go in the right direction to me when we're talking about transparency and building trust. But the fact is, which is extremely important, that our scientists are working very, very closely together, and they should be working closely together, sharing experiences and coming up with solutions together. More broadly, some other takeaways I would find from Silicon Valley here is that innovation ecosystems are rising to the occasion. You know, societies and economies change, and I think we're seeing Silicon Valley, major centers in China and around the world really stepping up on this. A lot of startups are going to have a hard time. A lot will fail. They'll have to retrench. Investment terms are going to tighten. But the fact is, there's going to be new investment. There's going to be strategic hiring in the right companies that are addressing the challenges that we have before us now. And so I think this is actually an opportunity for a lot of investors and a lot of companies, startups especially, that have the focus on these new challenges to really step up and to grow. And I think that also suggests that venture capital may be focusing more, along with private equity in the future, on really tough challenges, societal challenges, technology challenges, in a way they haven't before, or at least not until recently. Then across I do think supply chains will shift some. They were already shifting, I think, away from the massive concentration on China and just diversify. I think that's inevitably going to happen, but it doesn't mean a complete unthreading, I hope. I think just a diversification around things like medical supplies. Then lastly, I think we're seeing an acceleration of existing technology trends. This isn't new, but I think the virus, it's not radically doing anything new. It's just accelerating things that were already happening. So what do I think will be growing? Cybersecurity, and I talk about R&D and investment, industrial internet, biotechnology, obviously synthetic biology, biopharmaceuticals, quantum computing. I think robotics and automation is going to continue to change both manufacturing and services at an accelerated pace. Remote management of communications, we're seeing that now. Distributed work, distributed learning, telemedicine will all be more robust, and it's going to be enabled by hybrid cloud computing and big data analytics. And again, all of this was already happening, but I think we're seeing the impact of the virus accelerating everything in a way that I think will just reinforce existing trends and kind of reshuffle how investors and how markets look at some of these technologies. So I think for the U.S. and China, it's an opportunity. It's something that, frankly, I think can go both ways. There are pressures out there that would push China and the U.S. further apart based on what we're both experiencing and seeing around the virus situation. It's also an opportunity, on the other hand, for a reset if we manage it well, to say here we have a big mutual challenge, a global challenge. We have to drop some other issues for now and really find ways to collaborate. And it is an opportunity to really establish a new platform cooperation that we could perhaps build on for other things.
Thank you, Dr. Randolph. Very well said. And I think one example in this recent fight against the coronavirus, which is very encouraging and which should really be the model of international cooperation, was that in the first full week of January 2020, the Chinese scientists disclosed and reported to WHO the genome sequencing of the new coronavirus. Now, this was done in a very speedy way without political intervention at all. And I think by reporting to WHO, the scientific societies throughout the world had the same benefit of scrambling into action to develop vaccine or remedies of all kinds to save people from the coronavirus attack on mankind as a whole. I personally hope we will have more such cooperations, and such international cooperation should not be halted or erupted by whatever political motivations. And eventually, the real litmus test is that mankind will benefit from such international cooperation. And I think this is truly one shining moment of this recent fight against coronavirus. That is, scientists throughout the world can be connected together by modern technologies to more or less do the research at the same time against a common enemy. And the race is on. And I think whichever who comes up with a vaccine, whichever lab which comes up with a remedy against the coronavirus will help save mankind as a whole, whether it is a British lab, American lab, or Chinese lab. I think it doesn't matter by the end of the day. We just want to see mankind comes up with a solution, with a vaccine, with a remedy against the coronavirus. I would say in other sectors like 5G or in the Mr. Musk's attempt to connect the world by satellites, for example, all these are very worthy examples because eventually mankind will benefit from major breakthroughs in technologies. No companies like this, I believe, should be politicized, and they should be given incentives to break through, to blaze the trail for mankind to move forward. Because of the time consideration, let me now give the floor to Dr. Chen Jianguang, who is Vice President of JD Group and Chief Economist of JD Digits. And we know JD is a very important logistics company and a high-tech company, and very much in the technological cutting edge. And it is a major company. And I think in the current fight against coronavirus, JD company has made major contributions in China, but also through their services globally, they are making an impact on the world. And I think the world is better because of what JD stands for and what JD has done so excellently. So Dr. Shen, you have the floor for 10 minutes. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Especially thank you very much for your kind words towards JD.com. Actually, we are really proud, during this the pandemic, that we can continue to serve 400 million Chinese clients without any disruption. This is actually it's quite amazing achievement, given what we are seeing that, for example, the largest e-commerce company, right, Amazon, and had the delivery of goods in Europe and in America, so the had to be have a much longer delay in delivery during this pandemic period. But in JD, we actually have any delay in delivery goods. Normally, all the medical supplies can be delivered to the hospital within 12 hours after the order, even in Hubei provinces. So this kind of action and this achievement has to be combined with the Chinese government continuous support and the investment in infrastructure. I think that make a huge differences in fighting the pandemic. And also the mobile payment system in China has been widely used. So there's a lot of economic activity can be achieved online. So I think that could be another important trend in the future. Host, can I use some PPT, a couple of slides?
I think so. Yes, please.
Okay, I can maybe. I actually want to show you some slides about the fight against the pandemic. Actually, you can look at this Chinese GDP. The shock is rather severe. We know that the first quarter in China, the GDP declined by 6.8%. You know, that's the worst quarterly growth, actually, as far as the data are available. And also, we know that retail sales in China declined by 15.8%. That's really a severe shock to the Chinese consumption. And investment in the first quarter declined by 16%, right? So this kind of data had never been experienced in China. It shows how severe the impact. Of course, the Chinese government is using a lot of tools to alleviate the pain. But I think looking forward, actually, we are just past the first stage of the shock to the Chinese economy. So this is the first stage, is the shock to the production. We know that this is the production, this consumption of electricity. You can see that by second industry, the manufacturing, consumption of electricity declined by actually around 15% in the first quarter. You know, this shows how severe the shock is. And the second wave of shock Chinese economy experiencing is right now is about the cancellation of export orders. So because of this pandemic in other parts of the world, the Chinese exporters actually are suffering, you know, declining orders. This chart shows the U.S. market, the Chinese dependence on export sectors. For example, like computers, the telecommunication equipment, the first line. This is the export dependency ratio. So 50% of Chinese computer production has been shipped outside China, right? So the global pandemic slowed down the global demand, and that's actually the second wave of shock to Chinese economy is export sectors. So this also shows the interdependency of all the major global economy right now. So there is a common interest, right, to fight the pandemic. Actually, even though the Chinese government has been quite successful in containing the pandemic, but other parts of the world, if they cannot control the pandemic, the negative impact on Chinese economy is still very significant. This is, for example, computer 50% export, the Chinese production actually was shipped outside China. This is, for example, the other, you know, some textile products around 20%. So this shows this is second wave of the shocks. That's why the second quarter Chinese economy won't experience a V-shaped recovery. But the third thing, you know, it's been, I think, is the worrisome is the supply chain move after the pandemic, right? So this shows already in the U.S. market, the Chinese products market share. For example, in 2015, the luggage goods, the share is 70%, but last year the share declined already to 42%, right? So of course, this is, I think, partially due to the rising labor costs and partially due to this trade war. And other goods as well, like, you know, see a broad-based decline in Chinese goods market share in the US. So the question mark is whether this will continue trend after the pandemic. So how China will handle this impact. So I think this, to me, quite clearly, because there's a lot of material, but I will just quickly show you the way going forward is the digitalization of the economy, heavy investment in the digital economy, as well as the high-tech industry. So for example, I can show you this just interesting chart, right? So this is during Wuhan, you know, this the worst time. This is the unmanned vehicle by Jingdong to deliver medical supplies from hospital to hospitals. And also 5G has been deployed also in Wuhan, in the hospitals, actually to facilitate this online diagnosis of patients. I think this actually shows the future, about this digitalization of the economy, using 5G, using high technology, using mobile payment, right? Using this AI, big data, has been very important in fighting the diseases. That's also make possible that JD can still deliver goods during the height of the pandemic, even in Wuhan city. So this use, I think, is the why I believe, after the pandemic, there is actually, opportunity for further cooperation between China and other countries. Is Chinese this experience in utilizing 5G, utilizing AI, big data, using this kind of new technology to actually to help the economy recover, as well as to facilitate this kind of new economy activity like e-commerce. I think there's a lot of development in China. For example, I can show maybe there's a lot of wording, but it's in Chinese. But for example, the mobile payment, right? So it's contactless. This payment system is very widespread used, but in many other parts of the world, even in Europe, in many parts of America, also in Japan, cash has been widely used. But in China, it's almost no cash is needed, mostly using this mobile payment or also contactless payment system, online payment. So this actually shows this internet related business are booming, and not only facilitated the banking business, but also help online insurance business, online banking business. The Chinese government is also encouraging financial institutions to experience some other new type of activity, like this online opening of accounts. So I think it's definitely a severe shock to the Chinese economy, and of course, the government is taking it very seriously by easing monetary policy as well as fiscal policy. But more importantly, I think the focus is to facilitate this new technology, the widely spread of this new infrastructure investment. That to me is like a digital investment in 5G, in the widespread use of this like AI to revolutionize the traditional manufacturing sectors. So I think that's all I want to say. There's a hope and the lessons. There's also opportunities arising from this pandemic. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chen. I think very well said. I would point out personally that the great success of a company like JD is not only because their commitment to innovation and technological breakthroughs, but also because of their attachment to the largest market in the world, that is the Chinese market. And I think for some of the politicians in Washington, which I hear a lot about decoupling, for example, talking about decoupling, they simply miss another major point. For any successful company in the United States, especially in the manufacturing sector, to disregard the ever-increasing size of the Chinese market is not creating value for these American companies. It is actually destroying value for these American companies. Let me give you two examples. One is that we know for sure that everywhere, almost, if not all places in the United States, Apple shops now are closed. And elsewhere in the world, Apple shops are closed. But in China, Apple shops are in operation. They are open for business. So if you talk to Apple shops, whether you want to move out of the China market, it simply doesn't make sense to close shops which are in operation to the United States, where, for example, the shops are all closed. let me also talk about another example. It's a real example. We know General Motors and Ford Motors are being forced by the US government by using the National Defense Production Act to make ventilators. But do you know some of the most important spare parts of these American-made ventilators are made by an American auto manufacturing company now in operation in China? They have been in China for more than 10 years, but all their plants in the United States, in North America, are closed right now, but their operations in China is still open, and they get a lot of support to shift to the manufacturing of the spare parts, which are now being used by General Motors and by Ford Motors in the American-made ventilators. So I hope some of these politicians in Washington will really look at value, create more value for the American consumers, create more value for the American companies. Talking about decoupling, I think no company in the world can decouple themselves from the largest market in China. So don't bark at the wrong tree, I hope, and look at the global market and the world as a whole. No country in the world now can really hide behind an artificial wall. So I hope we will all talk about common sense, and we will put all the propositions through test and seek real truth from experiments. This is what Deng Xiaoping said, and this is, I think, mankind need to ponder, because if we deviate from this path of truth, eventually we hurt our own interests. Now, because of the time limit, may I give the floor to Professor Wu Xingbo, who is Professor and Director of the Center for American Studies and Dean of the Institute of International Studies at Fudan University in Shanghai. We know Shanghai is the largest city in China, probably one of the largest cities in the world. And Fudan University is a very important academic center in China, producing some of the top leaders in China, and also very, very active in international studies, including in China-US relations, which in my best judgment are the most important bilateral relations in the world. Professor Wu, you have the floor for up to 10 minutes. Thank you, Professor Wu.
Thank you, Mr. Gao. Good morning and good evening. I want to thank CCG for inviting me to this very timely and important webinar. Some of the previous panelists just talk about how technology has been used in the fight against coronavirus. But for me, was as important as, if not, was as impressive as, if not more than, that is also during the outbreak of the coronavirus, some in Washington, especially in the Trump administration, actually has been trying to push for technological decoupling between China and the United States. And 2 days ago, US Department of Commerce just released a new regulation tightening the control of dual-use technology to China, Russia, and others. I think China has been the major target. So even in a crisis like this, those people on their minds, the priority is still to pursue technological decoupling and to pursue the major power competition with China. So let me put the strategic competition between China and the United States in a historical context. Historically, major power competition is a norm, has been a norm, but they vary over time. Before the Cold War, major power competition was mostly manifested in military and geopolitical rivalry. And during the Cold War, there was a political and ideological dimension added to that. Today, we see more and more economic and technological dimension to the major power competition between China and the United States. Now, speaking of China, the United States, we all know that because of globalization in the last several decades, there has emerged a strong supply chain in technology between China and the United States, which benefited both sides. This should be a good thing, and they should continue down the road. However, when the Trump administration launched the strategic competition with China, they no longer view the technological supply chain between China and the United States in the context of globalization, but rather in the context of major power competition and geopolitical rivalry. So as a result of that, they changed their mind. That means they are trying to impose more and more restrictions on technological cooperation between the two countries. There seems to be a bipartisan consensus in Washington that the US should further tighten up the technology control with China. So if that's the trend, what will be the fallout? What will be the consequences of this kind of technological decoupling, or to put it further, technological Cold War between China and the United States? First and foremost, of course, China will suffer a lot from this because for a long time, China has relied on the technological supply chain in which the US has been a major part of it. However, I think gradually China will be able to overcome this problem by promoting the indigenous innovation, as someone already mentioned that, and also by forging closer collaboration with other countries. One typical example here is China's military modernization. After the Cold War, the US decided no longer to support China's military modernization. However, China managed to promote its indigenous research and development, at the same time expanding cooperation with Russia, Israel, and other countries. So China has come a long way in its military modernization without the support from the United States. So that's one example that the US cannot alone stop China from making technological progress in the area of military technology. And this logic applies to the civilian side or to the area of dual use technology. What will be the consequences for the US? Now, let's take one example. We just read a report that the Trump administration is thinking about to revise the foreign direct product rule. It's called FDPR, which basically is trying to prevent Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company from providing chips to Huawei. So if this happened, in the short term, this may deal a heavy blow to Huawei. But in the long term, it will force Huawei to seek indigenous innovation and also to find the alternatives. So I think Huawei, in the long term, they can overcome this challenge. On the other hand, I think the Chinese government, they will view as the last straw breaking the back of the camel in technological relations between China and the United States. And it will certainly retaliate by cutting off the access to the Chinese market by some of the major US technological companies. For them, Chinese market is a major source of revenue for them. So as a result of that, the US tech companies, they will lose the expanding Chinese market. And in the long term, they will also lose the access to China as a major source of innovation, because we know China is also emerging as a major source of innovation. Just like my friend John Holden mentioned, knowledge, innovation, technology is by nature something shared by people across the countries. So if the US can cut off this kind of technology supply to China, and China will likewise do the same to the US in cutting off the technology, knowledge, and innovation supply to the US. As a result of that, the consequences is that there will emerge two different technological systems with different technological applications, standards, norms, and markets. And this is not the end of the story. And I think this, cleavage will not just stop in technology. The fault line will extend to other areas like finance. What about the Chinese attitude towards the US dollar, to US federal bonds, to US dollar-denominated payment system, to US role in global institutions where it has played a major role in setting the rules of the game and setting the agenda? I think that will undercut Chinese support for US dollar as a major currency, undercut China's reliance on US dollar denominated payment system, undercut China's support for the US role in the global institutions. So this will also move on to the geopolitical area. Basically, you are actually trying to get countries to join different camps, because countries, they will take the lesson from China. That is, the US can weaponize trade, investment, and technology for political and geopolitical purpose. So that means the US is not a reliable partner in trade, investment, and technology. And they will seek alternatives. They will seek alternatives, even though some countries are trying to resist the pressure to take sides. Some of them, major economies can do that, but small economies, they may have to make a choice. And even for major economies, they resist the pressure to take sides, and still they have to pay have a cost because of two different technological systems. So sum up, my points, one is that my concern is that this kind of technological war, technological decoupling will continue as people in the Trump administration are pushing. And second, the consequences, the fallout of that will go far beyond expectation. The damage will not just be one way, China, but also for the US. For China, this may be a short-term pain, but it may be a long-term gain. For the US, this may be a short-term gain politically, but long-term pain, both economically and painfully. The last part is that how can business people, scholars, scientists, we can work together, trying to draw a line between, major power competition as well as, trade, investment, and technological relations between countries. I mean, it's to some extent, trade, investment, and technology will be used in this major power competition, but it should be a boundary so that they cannot become the hostage to the political and geopolitical contest between countries. I think that's the most pressing challenge for us all. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wu. I think you made a very good comments from the geopolitical perspective and focusing on China-US relations. You also mentioned the Huawei, which is a very important technological company in China, but also in the world. I personally believe Huawei actually has a lot of American genes. Over the years, they have used a lot of American consulting firms, McKinsey, Goldman Sachs, you name it, to advise them on their corporate governance, on their internal workings, for example, up to international standards. And for the United States to accuse Huawei as an enemy of the United States, in my view, is really barking at the wrong tree. And I remember one quote from Chairman Ren Zhengfei. He said the United States government is accusing Huawei of stealing American technologies. He said Huawei has more advanced technologies, especially in the 5G area, and you accuse me of stealing American technologies. These technologies, the US doesn't simply have. And I think, Huawei has the largest amount of patents and intellectual property rights, especially in the 5G. And we should acknowledge that as a fact. And now I'm personally very much enlightened by Elon Musk's endeavor to cover the whole world with satellite, which will leapfrog from the 5G. That means technological races are real. If you do not like 5G, you do 6G or the Musk's satellite network. And anyone to try to sabotage the satellite global network is not doing a favor to himself. Likewise, I hope the United States will not sabotage the 5G breakthrough led by Huawei. This is very, very important. I just learned that at present, the global audience attending our webinar numbers up to 750,000. So it's a 750,000. So I express my personal as well as CCG's thanks to the global audience for staying with us to listen to and watching this very important discussion about this very important topic. I think we now open the floor for questions. And CCG colleagues have downloaded quite a few questions from the internet. And we not only have about 750,000 people listening in, watching in, but also we have more than several dozens of international media listening in. Some of them have posted questions. Actually, I have one question for Michael Kuan. He was dropped because of technical difficulties just now. So I raise this question for Michael. The question is, the COVID-19 pandemic has triggered an urgent global effort to develop a vaccine, but some are not so optimistic about it. You mentioned that vaccines actually do not make money for big drug companies. Looking at COVID-19, are we investing enough to develop the vaccine this time round? Thank you, Michael. You need to turn on your mic, Michael. Your mic.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for this question. I think there's over maybe 100, 150 companies, private universities, different governments from last time I read are trying to come different treatment or vaccines for this coronavirus. I have seen some companies actually, both of them from the United States, and they're quite famous. And I think if we put enough effort, there's going to be some kind of vaccines coming out. People say are in maybe next spring. But we have to realize that how do we get to this stage? Actually, we have a huge AIDS infection. We have flus coming every year. And Bill Gates has warned us 5 years ago, and the pandemic is coming. And why do we have that? And I think we overlooked, and every government. And now it's a good time is to put those relationship or difficulties aside and to work together. I think U.S. and China relationship is not zero-sum game. I think U.S. and China, if they work together, the world benefits. And I think lots of people talking about decoupling or supply chain. I don't think the world is a supply chain matter. Supply chain is a big business matter. Actually, what I call is demand chain. We should focus the demand. Where are the jobs? Where are the healthcare needs? And I think this, if we work together, and then we'll find vaccines not only for this one, but also maybe for the next one. And if we don't have for the next one, and we figure out another way to do that, and we have to do that. So I think listen to politicians or people just saying that, you know, we can live without each other, and you win, you're going to lose. I think this is a bit childish. I'm very glad that I've seen that from investment flow point of view, we don't take care of, we don't think during this, especially during this pandemic, whose technology it is, whether it's yours, theirs, and invented by some other countries. As long as it catches mice, it's good for the people. So we should have this kind of view. And I think only with this kind of view, technology will improve, because technology is not built on one country and one set of people or one set of philosophy or testing. Technology is co-innovated, and that's the word, and it's not being used. Innovation is built on lots of dead bodies, and these dead bodies coming from all of the people, and so you should take a previous work and make sure that the next one. So as a VCs, as investment companies, we really don't think, especially in, well, of course, maybe in AI, in other things, which is very sensitive now. Even during this period, you look at the BGI, and there was is on the American 301 sanction list, but FDA approved their testing lab very, very quickly. I think that's a good sign. I think we should get SFDA, FDA, or CE markers work together and trying to figure out a way to have some fast proof and testing for various technologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kuan. There is a question from CNBC. It says, how may US-China non-governmental technological institutions work together in the fields like sharing, constructing digital information system and the digital information, both in fighting against the COVID-19 pandemic and post-pandemic? And I personally believe in the underlying message of this question. I think there is a lot of expectation and hope that both China and the United States can actually cooperate more rather than, for example, being pushed to get to each other's jugular.
Well,
fighting
Chinese,
China and the United States is no good for the Chinese people or for the American people. No good
Correct.
for world's peace and mankind as a whole. So any of the 7 distinguished panelists who want to answer this question? Yes, Michael. Yes, please.
Well, Chinese, we have say big chaotics lead to big peace. I believe that with this pandemic, and we have learned we need to share informations, and we need to share vital informations. And only we share, and not only between the governments, and also between the people and between the media, so we can improve. And I think we also need to share knowledge of online living or social distance. We're all been locked down, and we all have families, and we all learn from online. In China now, 340 million people every day online with their parents studying. And we can share that knowledge and that information with others. Why not share vital information? I think that, and only with share, we can improve. We can be better citizens for the world.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, Rob, please, you have the floor to answer this question.
Well, thank you. So I think that question really is about 2 things. One is current sharing around the virus and treatments and the like, and the other is longer term. I hope we would share more, but I think the reality is, at least if you look at the major studies, articles, claims in the US, including from the Atlantic Monthly magazine, there, and Sean alluded to this, there does appear to be real serious problems with how China has not shared information early on. Now, we can dispute whether that's true or not. I don't know, but I do know that that's the view in the US. And I think that will make sharing much, much more difficult. I actually think that the coronavirus has weakened relations. You would think they would bring us together, but I actually think it's weakened relations because of the perception in the US of how China has dealt with this. I think there's really sort of three main camps in the US vis-a-vis China. There's the sort of traditional camp of we should have more integration. I don't think that camp really has a lot of credence right now. I think the really only two viable camps are, can China reform in ways that limit several, maybe it was John that spoke about Chinese indigenous innovation policies. I've written about that and been involved in that for a long, long time. And certainly some of those policies are legitimate and fair, but we should be honest, some are not. And I think that, in my view, the way I read the US politics, I don't think we're going to go back to that older world. Even if a Democrat like Vice President Biden were to win in 2020, I don't think we're going to go back to that. And I think it's really incumbent upon China to offer up some serious reforms. I'm going to be blunt with you because I just don't think it's going to happen anywhere else. I think the decoupling train is left the station, and I don't think we're going to go back to that old way of doing it. And we can argue that's good or bad, but I think that's the reality we're living in now. And I think for China to want to change that, it's going to be incumbent upon Chinese policymakers to make serious changes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Atkinson. And I also see Professor Fu of Oxford University who has a view. Thank you, Professor Fu.
Thank you. I just want to follow up what Rob has mentioned about the reforms in China. Actually, China, I think about opening up and continue the reforms. What I see the signal is really firm from the government about a high level of openness. We see, even at the time of high time of the trade war, the government has mentioned that they want high level of opening up, and China benefits from globalization. I think it will continue to open up. And about reforms. And just 3 weeks ago, the government published a very important document about strengthening the role of market in the allocation of resources. I think that's one of the efforts. They want to strengthen the role of markets. And also in terms of the policy for innovation and science technology, and also for long, there have been discussion and a movement towards more competition neutral policy. So it reformed the policy to use more horizontal policy and also more target the technology and sector rather than winner picking the firms, improve China's policy. I think quickly in May, maybe we will see the new 14th five-year plan. Let's see what the signal and also the information that I get is moving towards further reforms and marketization is still on the way. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Fu. Now, Mr. Atkinson, you mentioned the reform. Let me make a personal point. I'm a firm believer, and I'm personally a firm promoter of reform in China. And I would say over the past 41 years, every day, China is moving into uncharted water. And the only way out of all these challenges and difficulties is to continue to reform, continue to open up to the world, continue to be a force of peace. There is no other choice. And I think in the United States, there are probably misunderstandings of what China really is up to. And I think this is one area that policymakers, decision makers, government officials, academics, corporates really need to do a lot of research and try to steer the course of development in the right direction. I personally don't believe China is an enemy of the United States. I don't think companies like Huawei are enemies of the United States. And despite of the fact that China is not a perfect country, there are lots of problems in China which need to be corrected, improved. China is, over the past 40 years, a force of peaceful development. And I hope through our discussions and webinars like this, we will better understand China-US relations, and we will contribute to preventing more deterioration of the bilateral relations, and also hopefully contributing to peace and stability between the Chinese and the American people. I have another question. It's a very interesting one. It says, as many believe that the US-China must collaborate to unite the world in the face of global crisis, as well as Professor Joseph Ney has suggested in this morning's Boao dialogue, that both China and the United States have missed their so-called Marshall Plan moment. Is it fair for the likes of global organizations and developing countries to bet their hope on the current international order, given the uncertain geopolitical conditions, especially between China and the United States? It's a very big and macro overarching question. Anyone who wants to take a shot? I think probably this is a question more logically belongs to Professor Wu of Fudan University.
Thank you.
Professor Wu?
Well, to some extent, I think the coronavirus broke out in a very unfortunate time in US-China relations. You have a government in the United States which believes in America first, which is very skeptical of globalization and global cooperation, which is very reluctant to play the leadership role in international affairs as it used to. So in that kind of context, how could you expect efficient cooperation between China and the United States in dealing with this kind of crisis? So I think whether or not people in Washington will draw lessons from this crisis is yet to be seen. But I think, in the long term, I believe people have no choice. Either we collaborate and cooperate and survive, or we will vanish in front of the major crisis. So this actually is the third major crisis we are confronted in the 21st century, after September 11th, after 2008 financial crisis. And this is the worst one in terms of China-US cooperation. Remember, this will not be the last crisis we are going to confront in the future. So if we do not draw enough lessons from the current crisis and the failure for better cooperation, we are going to make more sacrifice. So that is just a reality. People should seek truth from facts. Now let's go back. I just want to very quickly go back to the question about the indigenous innovation. People brought up this issue. I think this has been too much demonized in the United States. I think indigenous innovation is not a bad thing. As emerging economies, when they come to the certain stage, they become more ambitious, and very naturally they want to climb the value chain and become technological more competitive. That's just quite natural. So it's one thing whether countries should promote indigenous innovation when they are able to do so. It's another thing whether they do it in the right way, in a fair way. Okay, so in terms of indigenous innovation, I think a fair concern from the United States will be whether China will do better in protecting intellectual property rights, in pursuing the indigenous innovation, rather than China should pursue indigenous innovation or not. So I think Bob mentioned the reform in China's behavioral practice in this regard. If we look at recent laws and regulations, I think there has been a major strengthening of the protection of intellectual property rights. And of course, this issue remains to be an issue between two countries. But I just want to make sure that we focus on the right point of this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wu. I understand we are getting very close to the 120 minutes originally scheduled for our webinar. But after consulting with my colleagues in the CCG headquarters in Beijing, I think with the permission of our 7 distinguished panelists and with the permission of our 750,000 global audience, we can continue our discussion for another 10 to 15 minutes. And I hope this will be okay with our 7 distinguished panelists. And this is a question for Sean in particular, who is really very important in the Silicon Valley, in the Bay Area associations. And the question is, the demand for 5G will become all the more evident as the epidemic forces a transition of our day-to-day meetings and interactions to an online setting. So do you have a view as to what will be the major impact on major transitions and transformations of our daily life, as well as our work, social relations, for example, in the middle of this pandemic, as well as in the world of tomorrow, as I would say, that is the post-pandemic world of tomorrow? Thank you, Sean.
That's a great question. As I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of what we're going to see both right now and in the years to come is going to be an acceleration of existing trends by the coronavirus situation. Again, the groundwork has been laid over the last several years for a lot of what we're about to see happen. But much of this is going to be 5G enabled. So again, we're looking at probably an acceleration of distance learning. Though it's hard to say how much of this is going to stick. I have to say, here in the US, when we all started to be stuck at home, everybody started going to conversations and conferences on Zoom. And now we're seeing kind of this Zoom exhaustion. Everybody's online for 10 or 12 hours a day, it feels to me anyway. And now people are just very often wanting to not be online anymore. So I think we have to separate a little bit what we're required to do by the situation today versus what we will probably choose to do in the future. But it's a very, very good bet that a lot of what we're experiencing today is going to stick in terms of automation, robotics, not with the idea that we're going to necessarily have fewer employees or have more physical separation, but that's the way we were going, and this will accelerate investment in that. As I talk to colleagues at universities, University of California, San Francisco right now, as an example, they're completely online. Most universities are. Next year, the year after, how long will they stay all online? There will be face-to-face instruction, of course, but I think in the future, a much higher percentage of instruction will be online as well. And in organizations, private companies that I talk to, we're all working from home now. Of course, we'll come together again, but I think physical space will be reconfigured. People will be reconsidering how important it is or isn't to physically come together in offices the way we have in the past. We're still going to do it, but will we do it to a lesser degree, and how much is going to move offline or online? And then if you look at industrial automation and robotics, so much of this was already in play, but I think this is just going to accelerate even more. So a lot of this is obviously going to be 5G enabled. I think it'll accelerate the need to rapidly deploy 5G. So I think it's going to be a global imperative. It's happening in China, beginning to happen in the US now. So I think 5G will be the platform that enables this acceleration, but it's really moving more and more things into this digital universe.
Thank you very much, Mr. Randolph. I want to pose this question as we collect it from the internet to John Holden. It talks about the threat from the US government of ending or terminating major US semiconductor export to China, especially to companies like Huawei? And what will be the impact on the US semiconductor industry itself? Allow me to mention one point. When President Donald Trump of the United States mentioned that injecting disinfectant into human bodies will kill coronavirus in a minute, I think he is actually correct. It will kill coronavirus in a minute, but it will kill the person first. That's the point. You kill the coronavirus, but you kill the person first. So I think everything has two sides of the same coin, and we need to be really very much aware of the consequences of the action you propose or the actions that you want the government or a very, very important and the only remaining superpower to take. So if, for example, the US really goes along with this threat of cutting off semiconductor export to companies like Huawei or the high-tech industry in China, what will be the impact on the semiconductor industry in the United States itself? After all, China is roughly accounting for about a quarter of all the semiconductor exports from the United States. John, if I may pick your brain on this question.
Well, you've gotten into a highly technical field, of course, Victor. As I mentioned in my remarks earlier, the US has been controlling the level of technology that's made available to China now since the beginning of reform and opening. So this is not a new story, but in this particular case, what will be the impact? This deserves quite a bit of study. Industry doesn't like to be told what it can do. And so the semiconductor companies are certainly not welcoming this. Yeah, it's a very big decision. We've seen it coming along the way. And it leads me to a final thought, which is when we look at this relationship between the US and China and the ways that we cooperate, ideally you want to have a perspective of the national leader who can balance equities, who can say, okay, we might lose a little bit here, but we're going to gain more in this other area. So this is something that American presidents have been doing since Richard Nixon. It's difficult to manage. And one could reasonably ask whether Donald Trump, the current president, is doing a good enough job balancing the various interests that the United States has in its relationship with China. I'll leave that as an open question.
Victor, could I respond to that?
Yeah, yes, please. Yes, please. Thank you.
Well, I 100% agree with you. I think,
Mr. Atkinson, thank you.
Yeah, I think that, frankly, the U.S. should conduct its economic policies related to other countries in our own interest. And I believe that cutting off semiconductor exports to a company like Huawei is not in our interest. Now, it's very different than saying cutting them off to a military company. That's fine. We have rules around military exports. But cutting them off to Huawei, I believe, essentially will shoot ourselves in the foot. After Tiananmen Square, the US cut off exports to China, including telecom equipment. And this was a factor that led China to develop its own indigenous telecom equipment industry. So I think that number one, Huawei will likely get some of this technology from other countries, which doesn't help the US, countries like Japan or Taiwan or Europe. Or it will develop them on their own. There's a new story just came out, I think today, on Huawei chip development that was pretty impressive. So I just don't see this in our interest. I think it's a mistake that the administration is making. That's not to say that we shouldn't be engaged in pushing for, as I said before, stronger reforms. And I 100% agree. I'm not sure who said it. I think Professor Wu said this. There's absolutely a difference between indigenous innovation itself is not a problem. All countries have domestic innovation policies. It's really a question of whether they're in accordance with the spirit of the WTO. So that's what we should be pushing for. I think the semiconductor exports really are a bad ban, is a bad thing for the United States.
Thank you very much, Mr. Atkinson. A very quick question about standardization and whether, for example, bifurcation may occur in terms of technologies, standardizations, etc., especially in the ICT sector. We know in the middle of this fight against coronavirus, the different standardizations of protective facial masks actually have come as a hindrance to protecting medical staff in many, many countries and regions in the world. We have the N95, KN95, we have the FDA masks, etc. These differences in standardizations originally started for many other considerations, but in a fight against major pandemic like the coronavirus 19, I think of greater importance is to provide the protection to the medical staff in the front line of saving lives, as well as the general public. So I would say, and the question is whether, for example, by forcing decoupling of technologies or bifurcation of standards and standardizations in technologies as a whole, the world as a whole will suffer more than any country gaining anything in significance. And any of the 7 great authorities and experts? Michael, yes, please.
I just came out a meeting today. There's a group of people thinking about in China, and they're raising funds to help other countries to install assembly lines for masks, which I think is a great idea. I think this pandemic, we spend lots of time talking about the politics, you win, lose. And I still come back to this we should use this time to think, what is the future for technology, for relationship, and for nations? I think most of the people today in China, I think probably that's in the United States, and they're facing lots of uncertainties. And this uncertainty is even bigger than the relationship between the United States and China. I think U.S. and China relationship, I'm fairly optimistic, because I think the two elephants sometimes avoid to confrontate. But we really have to figure out a way to help the people. Now we are about to restart the economy. How do we learn from each other? I think, how do you standardize? I don't know if you can standardize a PPE. Maybe you can standardize, but how do you standardize to save industries like hospitality, airlines, and recreation? My son loved basketball game. There's no basketball game. So I think these efforts, this kind of global effort is needed. And that's why leaders need to work together. And it's not that what you have supply chain, it's not only about product, it's not about 5G. It's really about, we have 1.4 billion people next to us. India has 1.4 billion, 350 million people in the United States. What are we going to do after this pandemic? I think that requires lots more smart design and a leadership from both countries. And that's how I think it's standardization for the world.
Thank you very much, Michael. I see Professor Fu of Oxford. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Yeah, now you can hear me. I just want to follow up what Michael said. I think you also, Victor, you raised a very good question. This is one thing that we encountered when we try to help the developing countries like Africa, in South Asia, Latin America to build up their production capacity of PPEs. And in this technology transfer process, the standards, different standards, and this really come up as a real hindrance to the technology transfer process and the local capacity building. So I think the leading countries and under the, together with WHO, other multilateral international organizations can work together to, at this special moment, to agree on kind of more workable, feasible standards that the developing countries, low-income countries can also work and facilitate the technology transfer. So I think it's a very, very important issue if we think about the rest of the world.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fu. We still have many questions gathered online from major international media agencies, as well as those who signed up for raising questions. But as we always experience, time is not unlimited, and we are really coming up to the end of our webinar, very important webinar tonight. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank the 750,000 global audience in the United States, as well as in China and elsewhere in the world, for your patience in listening in to the discourse and discussions by the 7 great experts. And one webinar will not solve all the problems, but it is one of the steps going forward, hopefully in the right direction. And allow me to mention, I'm personally a firm believer in China-US friendship. And I'm a big promoter of China-US cooperation. My 2 daughters were born American citizens, so it gives me a personal family reason to promote peace and stability between China and the United States. The worst thing which can happen to me, to my family, to China, to the United States, is a total confrontation or a breakup of relations between China and the United States. And I believe mankind as a whole want to have these 2 largest economies in the world play a very positive, responsible role, not only in dealing with each other, but also in shouldering their very, very important global responsibilities. And I would also like to thank my colleagues in CCG headquarter offices here who are helping me in Beijing throughout our discussion tonight. And I hope I will see you very much soon in the future. And on behalf of CCG and on behalf of Henry Wang, who is the president of CCG, and all the colleagues of CCG, I thank you very much. And I wish you all the good luck. And God bless America, and God bless China, and God bless all the audience tonight, as well as all the wonderful experts tonight. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.